They left her barefoot in the snow. A torn hospital bracelet, flimsy and white, still clung to her wrist. Behind her, in the frozen earth, were two tiny mounds, two graves that should have been cradles. The wind was a monster. It howled across the empty Dakota fields, a raw, hungry sound. It lifted her bloodied hospital nightgown, making it flap like a ghost's banner in the swirling gray twilight. She stumbled forward, one step then another, arms wrapped tight around a stomach that felt like a hollowed-out cavern. Her eyes burned. From the frozen air, or maybe from the betrayal. Behind her, the farmhouse she once called home glowed with a sick, warm light. Inside, her husband was already laughing with another woman. Their silhouettes danced against the curtains, a cruel shadow play for an audience of one. He had told her it was her fault. Weak women make weak children, he'd snarled, his breath smelling of whiskey and rage. He had dragged her out by the hair, her body still a wreck from a war lost in a sterile white room. She couldn't even stand on her own. And when he threw her into the snow, the heavy oak door slamming shut behind her, the sound was the final crack of her broken heart. She sank to her knees. The cold wasn't just on her skin anymore. It was inside her, a shard of ice working its way into her soul. Her breath came out in shuddering clouds, each one a tiny ghost fading into the storm. It would have been so easy to lie down, to close her eyes, to just disappear into the white. But just as the darkness began to pull her under, a pair of headlights sliced through the blizzard. A truck door slammed, boots crunched over the snow, a steady, heavy sound. And then, rough hands smelling of leather and gasoline and cold earth lifted her gently from the ground. A deep voice, thick with an accent she couldn't quite place, rumbled close to her ear. "I've got you, darlin'. You're safe now." But she wasn't safe. Not yet. She had no idea that the man holding her was not a savior. He was just the first piece of a puzzle so dark and twisted, it would threaten to swallow the whole damn world. He was just the prologue to the real nightmare. The man wasn't a hero. He was a trapper, old and grizzled, with eyes like chips of flint. He wrapped her in a coarse wool blanket that smelled of wood smoke and dried blood, sat her in the passenger seat of his rusted-out pickup, and cranked the heater until her frozen skin began to sting. He didn't ask her name. He didn't ask what happened. He just drove. When they reached the edge of Dry Creek, he pulled over. The town wasn't much more than a wound on the landscape, a sun-bleached patch of dust where the paint peeled off the saloon shutters and the church bell hadn't rung in 50 years. "This is as far as I go," the trapper said, his voice like gravel scraping stone. He stared at the town with open disgust. Claire just nodded, numb. She could feel the whispers already, licking at the edges of the truck. "Listen to me, girl," he said, turning to face her fully. His eyes weren't kind. They were sharp. They were warning her. "You think that husband of yours is the devil? He ain't. He's just a spoiled brat playing with matches. The real fire is in this town. It's in the foundations. It's in the blood." Claire stared at him, confused. What did he mean? He grunted, seeing her incomprehension. "The Reed family. They ain't just farmers. They own this land and everyone on it. You stay away from them. And you stay away from that sheriff of yours. He's the worst of 'em all." He pushed a small, greasy leather pouch into her hands. "There's $100 in there. Don't tell anyone where you got it. Just get out. Go east. Don't look back." And with that, he opened her door and gestured for her to get out. He drove off before she could say a word, his taillights swallowed by the snow, leaving her standing at the edge of the one place on earth she had nowhere else to go. The trapper's words echoed in her mind. Stay away from the sheriff. But the sheriff was her father. Claire limped down Main Street. Every window was a pair of eyes. Every closed door was a judgment. The limp was a souvenir from the birth, a constant grinding reminder of the two tiny souls she'd carried, Noah and Grace. The town saw it as a mark of her failure. a physical sign of the rot they believed was inside her. Children were yanked to the other side of the street as she passed. Conversations clipped off mid-sentence. Grief, it seemed, was a disease you could catch. But it wasn't just the limp they hated. It was her silence. The way she didn't cry at the funeral. The way she didn't scream when her husband, Thomas Reed, threw her out of the house less than 2 days after she buried her babies. The way she didn't defend herself when the rumors started. She never wanted them twins. Cursed her own womb, she did. Thomas deserves a real woman. Not that broken thing. She heard it all. The truth was a stone in her throat. She had wanted those babies more than her own life. She had sewn tiny quilts with trembling hands, humming lullabies into the thread. But now, all she had was an empty cradle and a body that ached with a phantom weight. She reached the sheriff's office. The sign swung on a single rusted hinge, creaking in the wind. Her father, Sheriff Bennett, was a big man, but he seemed to shrink when he saw her. He stood behind his desk, polishing a gun, refusing to meet her eyes. "Dad," she whispered, her voice cracking. "What do you want, Claire?" he asked, his voice flat, empty. "He threw me out. Thomas. He threw me out in the snow." Her father placed the gun down. He looked at his hands, not at her. "Thomas is a Reed. His family built this town. He's going through a hard time." Claire felt the world tilt. "A hard time? He left me to die. Our babies are dead, and he—" "The matter is closed," her father said, his voice suddenly hard as iron. He finally looked up, and his eyes were cold. They were the eyes of a stranger. "You made your bed when you married into that family. Now you lie in it. Don't you bring your trouble here, girl. I've got a town to run." The trapper's words came back to her. He's the worst of 'em all. The betrayal from her husband was a knife wound. This, from her own father, was like having that knife twisted. She backed out of the office, the bell above the door mocking her with a cheerful jingle. She was truly alone. An outcast, a ghost in her own life. She had nothing. No home, no family, no money except for the trapper's greasy pouch. Nowhere to go but the one place that didn't ask questions as long as you could pay. The boarding house at the edge of town, run by a grim-faced widow named Mrs. Gable. Claire took a room, a tiny airless box with a lumpy mattress and a single window that looked out over an alley filled with trash. She spent her days in a fog, the hours bleeding into one another. The grief was a physical presence, a heavy blanket that threatened to suffocate her. But underneath the grief, a single cold ember of rage began to glow. Why had her father turned on her? Why did the whole town protect Thomas Reed? What was the real fire the trapper had warned her about? She started listening. In the general store, she'd linger a little too long in the aisles, her ears peeled. At the laundry, where she took a job scrubbing other people's filth for pennies, she paid attention to the gossip. The whispers were always about the Reeds, about their money, about their land, about the strange deliveries that came to their ranch in the dead of night. The town wasn't just judgmental. It was scared, terrified. And Thomas wasn't just a grieving husband. He was swaggering around town, buying rounds at the saloon, his new woman, a flashy redhead from the city, draped on his arm. He didn't look like a man in mourning. He looked like a man who'd just gotten away with something. A thought, ugly and sharp, pierced through Claire's fog. What if the baby's deaths weren't just a tragedy? What if it wasn't her body that had failed? What if it was something else entirely? This thought was a poison, but it was also a purpose. It was the first thing that had made her feel something other than pain in weeks. She had to know. She had to know what really happened in that hospital room. There was only one other person who was there for the entire nightmare. The midwife, a quiet, haunted woman named Martha. But Martha had left town the day after the funeral, packed up and vanished without a word to anyone. It was almost as if she'd run away. Claire knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that finding Martha was the key. She had to find her, but she had no money, no allies, and a whole town that wanted her to disappear. How could a broken woman with nothing to her name fight a family that owned everything? And that's when he appeared. It was like he'd been pulled from a different world. He rode into Dry Creek not on a fancy horse but in a battered old Ford truck, cleaner than most in town, its engine humming a low, steady tune. He wasn't like the other men. He didn't swagger or shout. He moved with a quiet, coiled intensity. He was leaning against the rail outside the blacksmith's shop, arms crossed, hat pulled low. Dust clung to his boots and the seams of his worn jeans. He didn't look like a man who needed anyone or anything. And yet, when Claire limped past, clutching a sack of flour to her chest, he looked up, and he saw her. Really saw her. Not with pity, not with judgment, but with a kind of quiet recognition. Like he knew exactly what it felt like to have the world kick you so hard you forgot how to breathe. Claire dropped her gaze, her heart hammering. She kept walking, telling herself it was nothing. But when she risked a glance over her shoulder, he was still watching her. His name, she learned, was Colt Maddox, and he was the match that was about to light the trapper's fire. Now, before we go any further, I need to tell you something. Stories like this, they take a piece of you to tell. If you feel even a small part of what Claire is going through, if your heart is breaking for her, please consider hitting that subscribe button. It's free for you, but it proves to me that these stories matter, that we're in this together. Now, let's get back to it. Colt Maddox wasn't a drifter. He bought the old Mallister Ranch on the far edge of town, land nobody wanted. Rocky soil, bad water, a house that was little more than a skeleton. He paid cash. That was the first rumor. The second rumor was about his past. Army, some said, or something worse. He had a stillness about him, an economy of motion that spoke of discipline or violence. He didn't talk much, kept to himself. He was an island in the gossipy sea of Dry Creek. Except for her. It was never obvious. A slight tip of his hat, just for her. The way he'd happened to be standing nearby when Thomas Reed got too close, his breath thick with whiskey, his eyes filled with a possessive rage. It was a silent shield, a quiet promise. For the first time since the world had ended, Claire felt a flicker of something that wasn't fear when he was near. But safety was a luxury she couldn't afford. Trust was a currency she no longer possessed. The first time they spoke, it was over a catastrophe of spilled laundry. Claire was coming out of the church, her arms loaded with second-hand blankets, when her weak hip gave out. The blankets tumbled into the dust. Immediately the whispers started. Mrs. Landry, the mayor's wife, clucked her tongue. A group of girls stifled giggles. No one moved to help. Claire bent awkwardly, her body screaming in protest. A pair of worn leather boots stopped in front of her. Before she could look up, rough, steady hands were gathering the blankets, brushing them off, and pressing them back into her arms. She looked up into his eyes. They were green, sharp, and clear as pine needles after a rain. "You're carrying too much," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. She just nodded, her throat too tight to speak. He didn't smile, didn't try to charm her. He just held her gaze for a beat too long, long enough for the town's disapproval to become a palpable wave of heat on Claire's neck. She mumbled a thank you and hurried away, her limp more pronounced than ever. The next time, he brought her a gift, a small brown bag with a pair of sturdy work gloves and a bar of lye soap. "For the washing," he said simply. "I don't take charity," she whispered, the words harsh. His mouth twitched. "Wasn't charity. It was payment for saving me from that gossip hen house back there." He tipped his head toward the church, where the town's self-appointed judges were still watching them. She took the bag, and for the first time in months, a genuine tiny smile touched her lips. but kindness in Dry Creek was like blood in shark-infested waters. It drew predators. Thomas Reed had been watching. He saw the way Colt's eyes followed Claire. He saw the flicker of something protective, something dangerous. And Thomas, who saw Claire not as a woman he'd wronged but as a possession he'd discarded, did not like it. One evening, as Claire was walking back to her room, Thomas cornered her in the alley. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging in like claws. "Stay away from him," Thomas hissed, his face twisted with jealous fury. "You're mine. Damaged goods or not, you're still mine. Don't you forget it." Fear, cold and familiar, washed over her. But then something else rose up, that ember of rage. "I'm not anything," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "Not anymore." She tried to pull away, but he tightened his grip. "You think he wants you? A broken, barren woman? He's just playing with you. Once he finds out what you are, he'll toss you aside just like I did." Suddenly, a shadow fell over them. Colt Maddox stood at the mouth of the alley. He didn't say a word. He just stood there, a silent, menacing statue. Thomas let go of her arm as if it were a hot coal. He shot a look of pure hatred at Colt, then sneered at Claire. "You'll see!" he spat, before stalking off into the night. Claire was trembling, leaning against the brick wall for support. Colt walked toward her slowly. He stopped a few feet away, giving her space. "He hurt you?" he asked, his voice a low growl. She shook her head, wrapping her arms around herself. "He just reminded me." Colt's jaw was tight, a muscle jumping in his cheek. He looked down the alley where Thomas had disappeared. And for a second, Claire saw a look in his eyes so cold and deadly, it scared her more than Thomas's rage. It was the look of a hunter who has spotted his prey. Then he looked back at her, and the look was gone, replaced by that same quiet intensity. "He's wrong," Colt said. "About you." He didn't say anything else. He just walked her back to the boarding house, his presence a silent wall between her and the darkness. But as he left, Claire noticed something. Tucked into his belt, almost hidden by his jacket, was the butt of a pistol. It wasn't the kind of gun a rancher carried for snakes. It was a lawman's gun, a city gun. The trapper's words came back again. "He ain't the devil. The real fire is in this town." And she realized Colt Maddox wasn't just a kind stranger. He had come to Dry Creek for a reason. He had a purpose. And she was starting to think it had nothing to do with buying a ranch. It had to do with the same darkness she was trying to uncover. The mystery of Colt Maddox was just as deep as the mystery of what happened to her children. And she had a terrifying feeling that the two were somehow connected. Claire knew she couldn't stay in the boarding house forever. The pennies from the laundry barely covered the rent, and Mrs. Gable's pity was wearing thin. More than that, she couldn't breathe in that town. The whispers, the stares, her father's cold shoulder. It was a cage. One morning, she took the trapper's money, bought a bus ticket to the next county over, and went looking for the midwife, Martha. She found her working in a grimy diner, her hands shaking so badly she could barely pour coffee. Martha's eyes were haunted, filled with a deep, abiding fear. When she saw Claire, all the color drained from her face. "You shouldn't be here," Martha whispered, glancing around nervously. "I need to know what happened, Martha," Claire said, her voice low and urgent. "In that room, the truth." Martha shook her head, her whole body trembling. "I can't. They'll kill me. They'll kill us both." "Who? Who will kill you?" Claire pressed. "Thomas?" Martha let out a choked, bitter laugh. "Thomas? That boy is a fool. He's just a pawn. It's his father, Old Man Reed." Claire's blood ran cold. Elias Reed was the patriarch of the family, a man who rarely came to town, but whose power was felt everywhere. He was a phantom, a bogeyman the town whispered about in hushed tones. What does he have to do with it? Martha leaned closer, her voice barely a breath. Your babies, Claire, your babies were perfect. They were healthy, strong, both of them. The world stopped. The clatter of the diner, the smell of grease, it all faded away. What? What are you saying? I'm saying they didn't die, Martha whispered, tears streaming down her face. They were taken. Old man Reed was there. He came in after you passed out from the blood loss. He had 2 other men with him. They paid me, they threatened my family, they took the babies and they told me to sign the death certificates. They said the Reed line needed to be pure, that they couldn't have their name attached to a child from a weak mother. The floor fell out from under Claire. Her children were alive. Her beautiful, perfect babies were alive. They hadn't died. They had been stolen. The graves were empty. The funeral was a lie. Her grief was a lie. Everything was a lie. The rage that had been a single ember now exploded into a roaring inferno. She stumbled out of the diner, the world a blurry, tilting nightmare. Her children were alive. And the Reed family had them. The most powerful, ruthless family in the state had stolen her children. How do you fight a monster like that? She needed help. She couldn't do this alone. And there was only one person in the world who had looked at her like she was a person, not a ghost. She took the first bus back to Dry Creek. She didn't go to her room. She didn't go to the laundry. She walked, all the way out to the edge of town, to the old Mallister place, to Colt's ranch. He was on the porch, hammer in hand, his sleeves rolled to his elbows. He saw her coming, saw the look on her face, and he dropped the hammer. Claire, what is it? What happened? The dam broke. The words came tumbling out, a torrent of horror and pain and white-hot fury. She told him everything. The midwife, old man Reed, the stolen babies, the lie. Colt listened, his face hardening into a mask of cold, controlled anger. When she was done, gasping for breath, he didn't offer empty platitudes. He didn't tell her it would be okay. He looked her straight in the eye and said, I believe you. And then he said 4 words that changed everything. I've met Elias Reed. The air crackled. The world narrowed to the space between them on that dusty porch. How? Claire whispered. How do you know him? Colt's eyes were dark, filled with a history she couldn't begin to guess at. My name isn't Colt Maddox, he said, his voice flat. It's Daniel Connor, and I was a federal marshal. He let that sink in. A federal marshal, the city gun, the quiet discipline, it all clicked into place. Was? She asked. I was, he confirmed, until I got too close to a man named Elias Reed. He runs more than just ranches, Claire. He runs an empire built on smuggling, blackmail, and human trafficking. He buys and sells things, land, guns, even people. Her heart stopped. Even people. Her babies. He ruined my partner. Colt, Daniel continued, his voice thick with a rage that mirrored her own. Got him hooked on drugs, then had him killed. Made it look like an accident. Reed bought the local law, the judges, everyone. He was untouchable. So I quit the marshals. I came after him on my own. I followed his trail here, to this forgotten little town where he runs his operation. I bought this ranch to watch him, to find a way to take him down. He looked at her, and the pieces of the puzzle slammed together with the force of a physical blow. His hunt for justice, her stolen children. It was the same monster, the same fire, Elias Reed. He thinks you're a broken woman who will just fade away, Daniel said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. He thinks I'm just some dumb cowboy he can ignore. He's underestimated both of us. He stepped closer, his green eyes burning with a fierce light. You want to find your children. I want to destroy the man who took them. It seems to me, we want the same thing. This wasn't about kindness anymore. This wasn't about a quiet romance building on a broken-down ranch. This was about war, a broken woman and a disgraced lawman against a kingpin who owned a whole town. The odds were impossible. suicidal. Claire looked at the man in front of her. Daniel. He wasn't just a shield anymore. He was a sword, and she was done being a victim. She lifted her chin, the fire in her soul burning bright and clean. "All right, Marshal," she said. "What's the plan?" The ranch became their war room. The battered farmhouse, once a symbol of hope and rebuilding, was now the headquarters for an impossible mission. Daniel unrolled maps on the kitchen table, old county surveys and newer, hand-drawn charts of the Reed properties. He had been watching them for months. He knew their patterns, the routes of the unmarked trucks, the names of the hired muscle. "Elias Reed is careful," Daniel explained, his finger tracing a line through the desolate hills behind his ranch. "He never touches the merchandise himself. He has lieutenants. The main one is a man named Shaw, a real piece of work. Ex-military, cold as a snake. If anyone knows where they're holding your children, it's him." Claire's hands curled into fists. "Then we find Shaw." "Not so easy," Daniel cautioned. "He sticks to the main Reed compound, a fortress about 20 miles north of here. Getting in there is suicide." "So we draw him out," Claire said, her mind racing. The fog of grief had been replaced by a sharp, cold clarity. She knew these people. She knew this town. She knew their weaknesses. "Thomas," she said. "We use Thomas." Daniel looked at her, a question in his eyes. "Thomas is arrogant," she explained, "and he's scared. He's a puppet, and he knows his father sees him as a disappointment. If he thinks he has something Elias wants, something that could make him look good, he'll get sloppy." The plan was audacious and incredibly dangerous. They would leak a piece of information, a lie wrapped in a kernel of truth. They would make Thomas believe that Claire had found something that could expose the whole operation, a ledger, a piece of evidence, something he would kill to get his hands on for his father. They needed a lure. Daniel disappeared into town and came back with a thick leather-bound ledger from the general store. It looked old, important. They spent the night filling it with fake entries, codes, and shipment dates that Daniel had gleaned from his surveillance. They made it look like a smoking gun. The next step was getting the rumor to Thomas, and for that, Claire had the perfect conduit, her own father. She walked back into the sheriff's office. This time, there was no pleading in her eyes, only ice. "I know," she said, her voice flat and even. "I know what you let them do." Sheriff Bennett paled. He opened his mouth, then closed it. For the first time, she saw not just a cold-hearted bureaucrat, but a terrified man, a weak man. "I have proof," she lied, her gaze unwavering. "A ledger. Everything is in it. The dates, the names, the children." She saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Not just fear, guilt. A deep, soul-crushing guilt. "What do you want, Claire?" he whispered. "I want you to do your job," she said, her voice dripping with contempt. "But I know you won't. So instead, you're going to do something for me. You're going to go have a drink with Thomas Reed, and you're going to let it slip that I have that book. You're going to tell him I'm planning on taking it to the federal authorities in the state capitol." He looked at her, his face a mask of agony. "He'll kill you." "Let him try," Claire said. "You just do what I say, or I'll burn this whole town to the ground, and I'll start with you." She walked out, leaving him to his conscience. She knew he would do it, not out of love for her, but out of fear for himself. The trap was set. Now, all they could do was wait. They didn't have to wait long. 2 nights later, the rumble of a truck engine broke the silence of the ranch. Daniel killed the lights in the house, pulling Claire down behind the porch railing. He pressed a heavy revolver into her hand. "Stay here," he ordered. "Don't come out unless I'm down. Aim for the center. Don't hesitate." She nodded, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. It wasn't Thomas's beat-up pickup. It was a newer, darker truck. 2 men got out. One was Thomas, looking nervous and jumpy. The other was a tall, lean man with a face like a predator. He moved with a chilling efficiency. It had to be Shaw. Her father's leak had worked better than they'd planned. Thomas hadn't come alone. He'd brought Elias Reed's top dog. "Claire!" Thomas shouted into the darkness, his voice tight with false bravado. "I know you're in there. Give me the book and we can end this. My father is a reasonable man." Shaw said nothing. He just scanned the property, his eyes missing nothing. He was the real threat. Daniel stepped out from behind the corner of the barn, his own pistol held loosely at his side. "Evening, boys," he said, his voice calm. "Bit late for a social call." Shaw's head snapped toward him. There was a flash of recognition in his eyes, and then pure, cold hatred. "Connor," he snarled. "I knew I smelled a rat, so you're the cowboy." "The book," Thomas demanded, pointing a trembling pistol at Daniel. "Where is it?" "Wouldn't you like to know?" Daniel said, a slow, mocking smile on his face. He was trying to draw their fire, to keep them focused on him. But Shaw was smarter than that. His eyes darted toward the house. "She's here," he said to Thomas. "Get the book. I'll handle the hero." And then everything happened at once. Shaw raised his pistol and fired, not at Daniel, but at the porch. Splinters exploded next to Claire's head. It was a covering shot. Thomas broke for the house, scrambling up the steps. Claire reacted on pure instinct. She raised the heavy revolver, just like Daniel had told her, and fired. The sound was deafening. The recoil slammed her shoulder. Thomas screamed, not in pain but in shock. The bullet had torn through the wood of the porch railing right next to him. He stumbled back, tripping over his own feet, and fell hard. Daniel was already moving. He fired twice at Shaw, forcing the man to dive for cover behind the truck. It gave him the opening he needed. He sprinted toward the porch, grabbing the fallen, whimpering Thomas, and hauling him into the house. He slammed the door shut, just as a volley of shots from Shaw hammered into the wood. They were trapped. "He's got us pinned down," Daniel said, breathing heavily. He was checking the magazine on his pistol. "He'll have backup on the way. We don't have much time." Thomas was on the floor, babbling. I'm sorry. She wasn't supposed to have a gun. My father will kill me." Claire knelt down and grabbed the front of his shirt, her face inches from his. The fire in her eyes silenced him. "Where are they?" she demanded, her voice a low, terrifying hiss. "Where are my children?" "I don't know," he cried. "I swear I don't know. My father, he handles everything. He said they were going to a better family, a family that deserved them." The cruelty of it stole her breath. "Where does he keep them?" Daniel pressed, his voice urgent. "His main compound?" Thomas shook his head frantically. No, too many people there. It's a secret place, a holding place, an old abandoned clinic, west of here, near the old silver mine." Daniel's eyes met Claire's over Thomas's head. The old clinic. It was on one of his maps, a place he'd marked as a possible dead drop, but hadn't investigated yet. Outside, Shaw was shouting, "Give it up, Connor! The whole county will be here in 10 minutes! You've got nowhere to go!" Daniel looked at the back of the house. "He's wrong," he said. He grabbed Claire's arm. "Come on." He dragged her and the whimpering Thomas to the back bedroom. He kicked open a small door in the floor that Claire had never even noticed. A root cellar. "There's an old storm tunnel," he explained quickly. "Comes out in the creek bed about a quarter mile from here. It's our only chance." He shoved Thomas down into the darkness. "You first. You're our insurance." Then he turned to Claire. "Go. I'll hold him off as long as I can and meet you there." "No," Claire said, her jaw set. "We go together." "Claire, I'm not leaving you," she said, her voice fierce. "And I'm not leaving him." She gestured at Thomas. "He's going to walk us right to the front door of that clinic." A slow smile spread across Daniel's face. It was a smile of pure admiration. "All right," he said. "Together." They scrambled down into the damp, dark tunnel. Behind them, they heard the front door of the farmhouse splintering as Shaw kicked it in. They were running out of time. The race to the clinic to her children had begun, and it was a race they could not afford to lose. The tunnel was a nightmare. A tight, suffocating tube of earth and stone that smelled of damp soil and decay. Thomas stumbled and sobbed ahead of them, a pathetic, blubbering guide. Claire and Daniel followed, their pistols drawn, every rustle of a rat in the darkness sounding like approaching footsteps. They emerged into the freezing night air, mud-caked and breathless, in a dry creek bed shielded by a thicket of willows. In the distance, they could hear sirens wailing, converging on the ranch. Shaw had called in his bought-and-paid-for cavalry. "They'll search the area," Daniel said, his voice grim. "We need to move, now." The old clinic was 5 miles away, through treacherous, hilly terrain. They forced Thomas to his feet and began a grueling march through the darkness, staying off the roads, cutting through fields and gullies. Thomas was their key, their unwilling map to the most important place on earth. Claire's body screamed in protest. Her hip ached, her lungs burned, but the thought of her children so close fueled her. It was a fire that burned away the pain. Noah and Grace. She whispered their names like a prayer, a mantra to keep her feet moving. After what felt like an eternity, they saw it. A dark, dilapidated building crouched on a lonely hill, silhouetted against the moon. The old silver mine clinic. A single dim light burned in one of the windows. "There'll be guards," Daniel whispered, pulling them behind a rock outcropping. He surveyed the building with a professional's eye. At least 2, probably more inside. "How do we get in?" Claire asked. "We don't," Daniel said. He looked at Thomas, his eyes cold and hard. "He does." He explained the plan. Thomas would walk up to the front door alone. He'd tell the guards that Shaw had sent him, that Connor and Claire had been captured at the ranch, and he was here to secure the assets. Once he got them inside, he was to create a diversion, anything to draw the guards away from the back of the building. "And if I don't?" Thomas sneered, a flicker of his old arrogance returning. Daniel pressed the muzzle of his pistol under Thomas's chin. "Then I will leave you here for Shaw to find," he said, his voice deadly soft. "And he will want to know how we found this place. I imagine his questions will be unpleasant. Or, you help us, and I let you walk away. Your choice." Fear won. Thomas nodded, his face ashen. They watched as he stumbled up the hill to the clinic. They saw him talk to a pair of armed guards at the door. After a tense moment, they let him inside. Now, they waited. The seconds stretched into minutes. Every snap of a twig, every hoot of an owl sent a jolt of adrenaline through Claire. Then they heard it. A crash from inside the clinic, followed by shouting. Thomas had done it. He'd created his diversion. "Now," Daniel said. They moved like shadows, sprinting across the open ground to the back of the building. Daniel found the window he was looking for, one that led to a supply closet. He pried it open with a hunting knife, the sound of the old wood groaning terrifyingly loud in the night. He slipped inside, then helped Claire through. They were in. The air inside was stale, thick with the smells of antiseptic and dust. They could hear the guards shouting in the front of the building. They were moving away from them. They crept down a long, dark hallway. The linoleum was cracked under their feet. Doors stood open on empty rooms filled with rusted medical equipment. It was a place of ghosts. At the end of the hall was a single closed door, the one that had the light on. Daniel put a hand on the knob, looked at Claire, and nodded. He threw the door open. The room was a nursery, a clean, warm, makeshift nursery in the middle of this derelict building. There were 2 cribs, and in the cribs, 2 babies were sleeping peacefully. Claire's breath caught in her throat. Her legs gave out. She fell to her knees, a sob escaping her lips. It wasn't a sob of grief. It was a sob of pure, overwhelming, impossible joy. Noah. Grace. They were real. They were perfect. They were alive. A woman stood by the cribs, a stern-looking nurse who gasped when she saw them. Before she could scream, Daniel was on her, a hand clamped over her mouth. Claire scrambled to the cribs. She reached a trembling hand out, her fingers brushing the soft cheek of the baby boy. He stirred, his tiny mouth making a soft sucking noise. She looked at the other crib, at the baby girl with a wisp of dark hair just like hers. Tears streamed down Claire's face, washing away the months of pain and darkness. But their reunion was cut short. A new sound reached them, the crunch of gravel outside. Not one truck, several. Headlights swept across the window. Shaw hadn't just called the local sheriff. He'd called in the cavalry from the main compound. They were surrounded. The clinic was a trap, and they had just walked right into it. "We have to go," Daniel said, his voice urgent. He was tying up the nurse with strips of bed sheets. "Back the way we came." Claire couldn't move. She couldn't take her eyes off her children. "I'm not leaving them." "We're not," he said. He grabbed 2 wool blankets. "Wrap them up. We're taking them with us." Claire worked with frantic speed, her hands clumsy with emotion. She bundled Grace into a warm blanket, her heart aching with a love so fierce it was a physical pain. Daniel wrapped up Noah. They each held a precious, warm bundle. Suddenly, the door to the nursery burst open. It wasn't Shaw. It wasn't a guard. It was her father, Sheriff Bennett. He stood there, his service revolver in his hand, his face a mess of conflict and despair. He looked at Claire, at the baby in her arms. He looked at the other baby in Daniel's arms. He looked at the tied-up nurse. The truth, all of it, was laid bare in this single, horrific tableau. "Dad?" Claire whispered. Footsteps were pounding down the hallway. Shouts echoed outside. "They're in the back! The nursery!" It was Shaw's voice. Her father looked at her, and in that moment, he had to make a choice. The town he served, the powerful family he feared, or the daughter he had wronged. He raised his pistol. Claire flinched, instinctively turning to shield Grace with her own body. But he didn't point it at her. He pointed it at the door. "Get them out of here," he said, his voice thick with a lifetime of regret. "The west window. It leads to the ravine. It's your only chance. Go. Now." He stood in the doorway, a broken man making his last stand. He was no longer a sheriff, no longer a coward. He was just a father. "Dad, no!" Claire cried. "I'm sorry, Claire," he said, not looking at her. "For everything." Daniel grabbed her arm. "He's buying us time. We have to use it." He pulled her toward the west window. She took one last look back at her father, standing silhouetted in the doorway as Shaw and his men rounded the corner. Then the gunshots started. Daniel shoved Claire and the precious bundle in her arms through the window. He handed her Noah, then climbed out after her. They didn't look back. They scrambled down into the darkness of the ravine as the sounds of the gunfight echoed from the clinic behind them. They ran. They ran through the night, fueled by adrenaline and terror and a desperate burning hope. They had the children. They had each other. But they were fugitives, hunted by a powerful enemy, with an entire corrupt county at their heels. The nightmare wasn't over. It had just entered a new, even more dangerous chapter. They had won the battle at the clinic, but the war against Elias Reed had just begun. And they both knew, as they melted into the wilderness with 2 stolen babies, that Reed would not stop until he had his property back, and until every last one of them was in the ground. The wilderness became their sanctuary and their prison. For days, they moved, traveling only at night, sleeping in caves and abandoned trappers' cabins during the day. Daniel, with his survival skills, kept them alive. He hunted, found clean water, and navigated by the stars. Claire, fueled by a primal maternal instinct she never knew she had, cared for the babies. She learned the unique cry of each child. Noah was quiet, watchful. Grace was feisty, with a powerful little wail. Feeding them was a challenge, keeping them warm a constant battle. But every moment was a miracle. Every tiny breath they took was a victory against the darkness. In the quiet moments, around a small, smokeless fire, they talked. Claire learned about the man named Daniel Connor, the dedicated marshal who had lost everything to Elias Reed's corruption. Daniel learned about the woman named Claire, the girl who had been buried by grief, but had clawed her way back out of the grave, stronger than steel. They were two broken pieces of two different puzzles that somehow, impossibly, fit together. A bond forged in fire and fear was deepening into something more. In the middle of a desperate flight for their lives, they were building a family, but they couldn't run forever. Reed will have the roads locked down, every lawman in 3 counties on his payroll looking for us, Daniel said one evening, cleaning his pistol by the firelight. We're living on borrowed time. So what do we do? Claire asked, rocking Grace gently in her arms. We stop running, he said. We turn the tables. We take the fight to him. His plan was insane. It was a Hail Mary pass in the final second of the game. He wasn't going to go to the federal authorities. Reed had his claws in too deep. It would take months, years to build a case, time they didn't have. No, he was going to expose Elias Reed to the only power he couldn't control, the public. There's a journalist, Daniel explained. A guy named Peters in the state capitol. He's an old-school bulldog, hates corruption. He's the only one I trust. If I can get him the proof, if I can get him the star witness. He looked at Thomas. They still had him, tied up and miserable. He was their last, most valuable card. The plan was this. Claire would take the babies and head for a safe house Daniel knew of, a remote cabin owned by a retired marshal he trusted. Daniel would take Thomas and the ledger and make a run for the Capitol to meet Peters. It's the only way, Daniel said, his eyes pleading with her to understand. We have to split up. They'll be looking for a man, a woman, and 2 babies. They won't be looking for a woman alone with 2 infants. You'll have a better chance of getting through. Claire hated it. The thought of being separated from him, even for a few days, was terrifying. But she knew he was right. They said their goodbyes under a canopy of stars, the babies sleeping soundly. He kissed her, a deep, desperate kiss filled with fear and promise. I will find you, he said. I swear it. You better, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. He held Grace's tiny hand for a moment, then Noah's. Then he and Thomas melted into the darkness, heading east. Claire took a deep breath, hitched her precious bundles higher, and turned west, toward the promise of safety. The journey was harrowing. Claire bought a beat-up old station wagon for a few $100s and drove, her eyes constantly scanning the rear-view mirror. Every police car she saw sent a spike of terror through her. She drove for 2 days straight, surviving on coffee and fear, the babies sleeping in a laundry basket on the passenger seat. She finally found the cabin, tucked away deep in the national forest, just as Daniel had described. An old man with kind eyes and a shotgun met her on the porch. He was Daniel's friend, the retired marshal. His name was Hank. You made it, girl, he said, his voice a warm rumble. Daniel called. Said you were coming. Said you were something special. For the first time in weeks, Claire felt a sliver of safety. Hank and his wife Mary welcomed her in. They fussed over the babies, clucking and cooing, their home a warm haven after the cold terror of the wilderness. Days turned into a week. Claire waited. She watched the news, her heart in her throat every time the newscaster came on. But there was nothing. No story about Elias Reed. No mention of a corrupt empire crumbling. Nothing. And Daniel didn't call. The silence was a screaming void. The hope that had carried her began to curdle into a new, sickening fear. What if he hadn't made it? What if Reed's men had caught him? One night, Hank came into the kitchen where Claire was warming a bottle. His face was grim. There's a story on the wire, he said, his voice low. About a shootout on the highway near the Capitol. 2 men dead. One of them was a known associate of Elias Reed. Claire's heart stopped. "And the other?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Unidentified male," Hank said gently. "They're saying it was a deal gone wrong." Claire dropped the bottle. It shattered on the floor, but she didn't notice. The world went silent. The warmth of the cabin, the smell of baking bread, it all disappeared. There was only a cold, black emptiness. Daniel was gone. He had failed. They had lost. And Elias Reed was still out there. Now he would be hunting her. Not just to get his property back, but for revenge. She had his son, his only heir, and she was responsible for his death. The safety of the cabin had become a cage. She knew Reed's reach was long. He would find her. It was only a matter of time. Hank and Mary tried to comfort her, but she was beyond comfort. The fire inside her was gone, replaced by the cold ashes of despair. She looked at her children, her beautiful, perfect children, and she saw not a future, but an ending. She had saved them from one monster only to lead them into the jaws of another. A few days later, a black car rolled up the long gravel driveway to the cabin. Claire saw it from the window, her blood turning to ice. It wasn't a police car. It was expensive. The kind of car Elias Reed would drive. This was it. He had found them. Hank stood on the porch, his shotgun held ready. "Get the babies in the cellar, Claire," he ordered. But Claire didn't move. She was done running, done hiding. She walked to the door, her face a pale, determined mask. If this was the end, she would face it on her feet. The car door opened. A man in an expensive suit got out. He was old, with a mane of white hair and eyes as cold and dead as a frozen river. It was him, Elias Reed. He walked slowly toward the porch, his eyes fixed on Claire. He didn't even glance at Hank's shotgun. He stopped at the bottom of the steps. "You've caused me a great deal of trouble, girl," he said, his voice a dry rustle of leaves. "You took my son from me, and you took my grandchildren." "They are not your grandchildren," Claire said, her voice shaking but clear. "They are my children." Reed let out a dry chuckle. "Semantics. They have my blood. That makes them my legacy, a legacy my weak, foolish son was unfit to carry on." The casual cruelty of it was breathtaking. He wasn't mourning Thomas. He was angry about the inconvenience. "You're a brave woman," Reed continued, a strange, almost admiring look in his eye. "Braver than I expected. But bravery is no match for power. I have men surrounding this cabin. You have an old man with a shotgun. It's over. Give me the children, and I will let you and these good people live." Claire clutched the locket around her neck, the one she'd bought to hold a picture of the babies. This was the choice. Her life. For her children's. To give them up. To let them be raised by this monster so that they might live. But as she looked into his cold, dead eyes, she knew. It was a lie. He would never let her live. She was a loose end. Suddenly, a voice crackled over a radio from inside Reed's car. "Sir, we have a problem. There's a column of vehicles coming up the main road. Federal plates." Reed's head snapped toward the car. A flicker of surprise, then annoyance, crossed his face. Headlights appeared at the end of a long driveway. Not one car, a dozen. Black SUVs with government plates, swarming the property, surrounding Reed and his men. Doors opened. Men in tactical gear, carrying automatic weapons, poured out, taking up positions. And then, from the lead vehicle, a man stepped out. He was wearing a suit, but he moved with a familiar, easy grace. He wasn't smiling. His face was all business. It was Daniel. Claire's mind couldn't process it. He was alive. He was here. He wasn't alone. Daniel walked toward them, his eyes never leaving Elias Reed. He stopped beside Claire on the porch, a silent, solid presence. Reed stared at him, his composure finally cracking. "Connor," he hissed. "Impossible." "You should have killed me when you had the chance, Elias," Daniel said, his voice cold and even. "The shootout on the highway wasn't me. It was your people cleaning up your mess. They killed Thomas because he knew too much. But you made one mistake. You let the journalist Peters live, and I got to him first." He gestured to the federal agents. "The story broke this morning, all of it. The smuggling, the trafficking, the stolen babies, the whole world knows who you are now." He pulled a pair of handcuffs from his belt. "Elias Reed, you're under arrest for kidnapping, conspiracy, and the murder of a federal officer." Reed looked at the agents, at Daniel, at Claire. He was trapped. The empire he had built on fear and shadow had been brought down by a disgraced lawman and a broken woman who refused to stay broken. He didn't resist. He didn't fight. He simply held out his hands. And as the agents led him away, he looked back at Claire, a look of pure, unadulterated hatred in his eyes. It was a promise that this wasn't over. But as Claire watched the black car disappear down the driveway, with Daniel's hand resting protectively on her shoulder and the sound of her children crying safely inside the cabin, she knew that it was. The war was over. They had won. In the aftermath, the world shifted. The Reed Empire crumbled, its secrets laid bare for the world to see. The town of Dry Creek had to face its own complicity, its own cowardice. Some fled. Some faced justice. The town itself began a slow, painful process of healing. Claire's father was given a reduced sentence for his cooperation. In his testimony, he spoke of the gunfight at the clinic. He had survived, wounded but alive, and his testimony was the final nail in Shaw's coffin. Claire visited him once in prison. There were no easy words, no simple forgiveness. But there was a beginning, a fragile, tentative hope for a future that wasn't defined by the past. Daniel was reinstated as a federal marshal, a hero, but he turned it down. His war was over. He had found something more important than a badge. He came back to the cabin, to Claire and the children. He came back home. A month later, under a blanket of stars, they were married. Not in a church, but on the porch of Hank and Mary's cabin. Their only guests were the old marshal and his wife, and two beautiful babies gurgling in a bassinet. Daniel, slipped a simple silver ring onto her finger. "You're my home now, Claire," he whispered. Claire smiled through her tears, resting her forehead against his. "And you," she said, "are my miracle." They eventually went back to the old Mallister Ranch on the edge of Dry Creek. It wasn't a place of ghosts anymore. It was a place of new beginnings. They rebuilt it, not just the fences and the barn, but the life that was lived there. They filled it with the sounds of laughter, with the pitter-patter of tiny feet learning to walk. One evening, as the first snow of winter began to fall, Claire stood on the porch, watching Noah and Grace take their first stumbling steps in the powder. Daniel came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. She wasn't the same woman who had been left barefoot in the snow. That woman was a ghost, a memory. This woman was a survivor, a fighter, a mother. She had walked through the fire and come out the other side, not burned but forged. The world had tried to break her, had tried to bury her, but they didn't know. She was never a curse. She was never just a victim. All along, she was the storm. If you were moved by Claire's journey from the darkest depths of despair to the light, please do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. It tells me that stories of strength, survival, and the unbreakable human spirit are what you want to see. And believe me, I have so many more stories to share. Thank you for listening.